The paper sat between them like a death warrant. Lydia Sullivan did not move. She did not reach for it, did not flinch away from it, did not allow the single tremor that had been building in her right hand since she walked through the door of the Territorial Land Office to become visible to the man seated across from her. She simply looked at Marcus Donovan with steady gray eyes and waited for him to speak first. He did not speak. That was his technique, and she had known it would be. She had asked around. She had listened to every whispered word in every saloon and mercantile and church pew in Redemption Creek, Arizona Territory, in the 3 weeks since she had decided to come here and fight. People spoke of Marcus Donovan the way they spoke of flash floods and rattlesnakes. Not with hatred exactly, but with the particular reverence reserved for forces that did not negotiate with human sentiment. He was said to be the most feared land negotiator the federal government had placed west of the Mississippi. He had relocated 17 families from their deeded properties in the past 2 years alone. He had done it legally, he had done it precisely, and he had done it without once raising his voice. He was rumored to have made a 70-year-old widow cry in this very office, and then filed her papers before her tears had dried on the oak desk between them. Lydia Sullivan was 26 years old. She was a schoolteacher, a daughter, and now, for the past 8 months, a woman carrying the weight of her dead father's land deed in her coat pocket like it was the last piece of him left on this earth. She was not going to cry. Marcus Donovan watched her with dark eyes that gave nothing away. He was broad-shouldered and lean, with the kind of face that had been shaped by the sun and by something harder than sun. He wore a gray suit that was too fine for a government office in a territorial town, and his dark hair was combed back with careful precision. He looked like a man who had decided at some point in his life to make himself into something unreadable. He placed his hands flat on the desk. She placed her hands flat on the desk. The clock on the wall behind him ticked. Somewhere outside, a horse stamped in the street. The late afternoon light came through the single west-facing window and cut a line of gold between them. "Miss Sullivan," he said finally, and his voice was low and even and infuriatingly calm. "You understand that the land grant your father held expired upon his death, pursuant to Section 4 of the Homestead Revisions of 1878. The property in question reverts to territorial jurisdiction unless continuous occupation and cultivation can be demonstrated. I understand the law as you have chosen to interpret it," she said. "I also understand that my father was working that land the day he died, that his cattle are still on it, that I have been living on it and teaching school in Redemption Creek for 8 months, which constitutes continuous occupation under any reasonable reading of the statute." Something shifted behind his eyes. It was small, almost nothing, but she caught it. "You have reviewed the statute," he said. "Cover to cover," she said. "Twice." A pause. The gold line of light moved slightly on the desk between them. "The Continental Land and Cattle Company has filed a competing claim," he said. "They have resources and legal counsel that they have corruption and purchased influence," she said quietly. "Which is a different thing, Mr. Donovan, though I understand that in this office the distinction may sometimes be difficult to locate." The air in the room changed. The temperature of it seemed to drop 2 degrees. His jaw tightened, barely perceptibly, and she felt the danger in it the way she might feel the air pressure change before a storm. She had just accused a federal officer of corruption, sitting in his own office, with no allies and no weapon but the truth. She did not look away. This was the moment that everything in the next 6 months would hinge on. She did not know that yet. She would know it later, on a winter night, lying in the warmth of a life she had not expected to build, looking back at this afternoon and understanding exactly when things had changed. But in the room, in that burning October light of 1882, Lydia Sullivan sat across from Marcus Donovan and did not blink. To understand how she had arrived in that chair, in that office, facing that man, you have to go back to the first week of March, 8 months earlier, when a rider came to the Sullivan homestead at dusk with a message that her father, Robert Sullivan, had collapsed in the south pasture, and was not going to stand up again. Robert Sullivan had come to Arizona Territory in 1874 with a homestead filing and a stubborn dream. He had been a widower since Lydia was 7, and he had raised her on the land the way other fathers raised daughters on Scripture, with a combination of absolute conviction and daily practice. He believed that soil was a covenant, that if you worked a piece of earth faithfully and honestly, it owed you something in return. He had coaxed wheat and corn and grazing grass out of a plateau that most men would have ridden past without a second look. He had built a house, a barn, a fence line that stretched 3 miles. He had registered his deed, paid his taxes, and by 1879 he held the land cleanly under the Homestead Act. What he had not accounted for was the Continental Land and Cattle Company, which did not exist in 1874, and which by 1882 had decided that the Sullivan Plateau, with its underground water and its rail proximity, was exactly what it needed to expand its territorial holdings. Continental was not interested in buying the land at a fair price. Continental was interested in obtaining it at whatever price the law could be persuaded to enforce. And the law, in this part of Arizona Territory, had recently acquired a face. That face belonged to Marcus Donovan, who had arrived in Redemption Creek 18 months ago with a federal appointment, a reputation that preceded him by 3 counties, and a set of files that seemed to contain the legal vulnerabilities of every homestead in the region already cataloged and ready to deploy. Robert Sullivan had known this. He had written to Lydia about it in January, a letter that arrived at her school in Tucson with a particular urgency in the handwriting that she had recognized immediately as fear. Her father did not scare easily, but the letter said, between its careful lines, that something bad was coming and he did not know how to stop it. She had written back with reassurance she did not fully feel and promises to come home in the summer when the school term ended. He had died in March before she could. She had come home anyway, immediately, and what she had found on the homestead was worse than she had expected. The Continental Company had filed its competing claim within 3 weeks of her father's death, moving with the kind of speed that told her they had been waiting for exactly this moment. The land office had sent a notice of provisional jurisdiction, signed by Marcus Donovan, informing her that the property was under review. She had 60 days to respond. She had used those 60 days to learn everything she could about land law. She had read the Homestead Act and its revisions. She had written letters to a land attorney in Tucson who had written back with cautious advice about the strength of continuous occupation claims. She had gathered statements from her neighbors, the Ray's family and the Abercrombies and old Walter Crane, all attesting to the fact that she had been present on the land and maintaining it without interruption. And she had prepared herself to walk into that office and face whatever was waiting there. What was waiting there was Marcus Donovan, and the first thing she noticed about him, before she registered the breadth of his shoulders or the coldness of his professional manner, was that he looked tired, not the tired of a man who had stayed up late, something older than that, something that lived in the corners of his eyes and the set of his mouth. She had filed that observation away like she filed everything that might prove useful. The meeting in October ended without resolution. He told her the case was under review. She told him she would return. She gathered her papers, stood with her back straight, and walked out of the land office into the dusty warmth of Redemption Creek's Main Street, and only then, standing in the October sun with her hand pressed flat against the wall of the building, did she allow herself one long breath that was almost a shudder. She had held her ground, but she had not won anything yet. What she had won, though she did not know it, was the complete and total attention of Marcus Donovan. He sat in his office for a long time after she left, looking at the door she had closed behind her, which no one since he had arrived in Redemption Creek had closed quietly. Everyone else either slammed it in anger or crept out in defeat. She had closed it with the precise care of someone who did not want to give away any more than they had already given. He pulled her file toward him. Lydia Sullivan, age 26, born Tucson, Arizona Territory, graduate of the Arizona Normal School, employed as schoolteacher Tucson 1879 through 1882, current resident Sullivan Homestead, Redemption Creek District, unmarried. He read the supporting documents she had filed, the statements from neighbors, the original deed registration, her father's tax receipts, every one of them in chronological order tied with a piece of cotton string, and a letter she had written herself, addressed to the office, laying out the legal argument for her continuous occupation claim in clear, methodical language that bore no trace of the desperation that must have been driving it. He had seen hundreds of homesteaders in 2 years of this work. They arrived in his office with grief and anger, and sometimes with lawyers, and sometimes with nothing but pride, and he had processed their cases with the same professional neutrality he had been trained to apply to everything. It was, he had told himself, the only fair way. You could not allow sentiment to enter into land law, because sentiment had no legal standing, and if you permitted it in one case, you would be drowning in it inside a month. But he had not encountered anyone who presented their case like Lydia Sullivan presented hers, without tears, without begging, without the kind of desperate performance that people often fell into when they felt they had nothing left. She had presented it like she was teaching a lesson, like she expected him to follow the logic and arrive at the correct conclusion, and was prepared to be patient while he did. He placed the file on top of his stack and told himself he would review it as he reviewed every other file. With neutrality, with precision. He reviewed it that night by lamplight, alone in the rented room above the assay office where he lived, and he was still reading at midnight. The Continental Land and Cattle Company's claim had problems. He had known this when they filed it, but he had filed it anyway because it was his job to receive filings and process them according to procedure, not to dismiss them at the door. The legal argument Continental was making relied on a specific interpretation of the homestead revision that was, to put it plainly, creative. It was not impossible, but it required you to ignore several inconvenient facts, the largest of which was that a living, breathing heir who was actively occupying the land had shown up and very clearly intended to make the counterargument. He read the statute again. He read it a second time. He thought about what she had said, that he was interpreting the law, not simply applying it, that between interpretation and corruption there was a distinction he might be having difficulty locating. It had stung. He did not like admitting that it had stung, because he prided himself on the particular freedom that came with not caring what people thought of him. He had cultivated that freedom over a long time, and at considerable personal cost, and he was not pleased to discover that 6 words from a schoolteacher from Tucson had gotten under the armor of it. But they had, and sitting with his lamp burning low and the October wind coming through the gap at the bottom of his window, he tried to understand why. The truth, the dark and inconvenient truth that he had been refusing to examine too closely for the past 18 months, was that he had come to Redemption Creek with a secret. Not a secret in the melodramatic sense, not a crime hidden behind a pleasant face, but a forced choice, the kind that left permanent marks. 2 years ago, Marcus Donovan had been a different kind of attorney. He had been in private practice in Santa Fe, building a small but respected career representing homesteaders and small landholders against the encroachment of the large cattle syndicates that were quietly buying up the territorial West through legal pressure and strategic litigation. He had been good at it. He had won cases that people had told him were unwinnable. He had believed, with the particular intensity of a man who had grown up poor and land poor, and deeply aware of what it felt like to have nothing stand between you and loss, that the law was supposed to protect people like the ones he represented. Then a man named Frederick Hollies had walked into his office. Hollies was the regional director of Continental Land and Cattle. He had sat down across from Marcus with the relaxed confidence of someone who already knew how the conversation was going to end, and he had made an offer. Not a bribe, nothing so crude. An offer of employment. a federal appointment already arranged to serve as land negotiation officer for the Redemption Creek district. A salary 3 times what Marcus was making in private practice. And an understanding, never stated directly, that the appointment had been arranged through Continental's considerable political connections, and that a man who understood which way his bread was buttered would not find himself doing anything to embarrass the people who had buttered it. Marcus had needed the money. He did not like admitting this either, but it was the plain truth. His younger brother Daniel had been injured in a mining accident the previous spring, and the medical debts were severe, and their mother in Santa Fe was aging and could not work, and the private practice was not generating enough to cover everything no matter how many hours Marcus worked. He had been drowning quietly, the way competent people sometimes drowned, with their head just barely above water and their face set in the expression of someone who had everything under control. He had taken the appointment. He had told himself it was not a compromise, that he could be fair within the system, that the federal role gave him the ability to enforce the law as written, and the law as written was supposed to protect everyone equally. What he had found, arriving in Redemption Creek, was that the law as interpreted in this district had been bent into a shape that mostly favored Continental. The previous officer had been, to put it charitably, accommodating. The case files were full of homestead claims that had been dismissed on technicalities that a first-year law student would have identified as nonsense. Continental had filed competing claims on over 30 parcels. Many had already been resolved in the company's favor. Marcus had processed the files as he found them. He had approved some, denied others, sent several back for additional documentation that gave the homesteaders more time. He had tried, in his own way, to thread the needle between the implicit expectations of his appointment and the explicit requirements of the law. He realized now, reading Lydia Sullivan's file at midnight, done a great deal more threading and a great deal less protecting than he had intended. The Sullivan case was the one that would not let him sleep. He did not know yet that she was also awake, that she was sitting at the kitchen table of the homestead 8 miles out of town, by the light of the same kind of oil lamp, with the same statute open in front of her, reading the same paragraph he was reading, with her jaw set and her father's cattle sleeping in the dark barn outside. November in Redemption Creek was cold at night, and the wind came off the plateau with a particular insistence. Lydia pulled her shawl tighter and turned a page. She had not cried for her father since the first week. She was not made for sustained grief. She had her father's temperament, which was the temperament of someone who processed loss by doing something about it, immediately, with whatever was at hand. So she had cried for a week, and then she had started reading land law, and the reading had kept the grief at a useful distance. What she had found in the reading was this: she was right. Not just emotionally, not just morally, but legally. The continuous occupation doctrine, as established by federal precedent, was clear. An heir who occupied the land without interruption following a homesteader's death had a strong claim to continuation of the deed. Continental's argument required the court to accept that the deed died with her father and that her presence was irrelevant, which was, when you stripped away the legal language, an argument that a woman's presence on land did not constitute real occupation. She found that particular argument deeply offensive. She had drafted her formal legal response. She had sent a copy to the attorney in Tucson. She had filed it with the land office and received a confirmation stamp that she had folded and placed in the same pocket as her father's deed. What she had not been able to figure out was Marcus Donovan. She had expected, walking into that office, to find a certain type of man, the venal, comfortable type, the type who wore his corruption like a well-fitted coat and met your eyes with the bland confidence of someone who had never been held accountable for anything. She had known men like that in Tucson. She had known women who had been swallowed by men like that, through legal means and social pressure, and the simple machinery of power applied patiently over time. Marcus Donovan was not that type, or if he was hiding it better than she had anticipated. There was something in him that she could not quite categorize. A tension, not the external tension of a man bracing for confrontation, but an internal one, like a man who was holding two contradictory things inside his chest and was not sure which one was going to win. She had thought about that tension on the ride home from town. She had thought about it several times since. She did not think she should be thinking about it. She had a land claim to win and a homestead to maintain and 37 students who came to the one-room schoolhouse in Redemption Creek every Monday through Friday. And she did not have the luxury of thinking too carefully about the interior life of the man who was processing her case. But she thought about it anyway. The second time she came to the land office was in November, 12 days after the first meeting. She came with an additional document, a letter from the Tucson attorney with a legal citation she wanted to include in her formal record. She had not sent word ahead. She arrived at 8 in the morning, when the office was just opening, and she found Marcus Donovan already at his desk with his coat still on, which suggested he had either arrived very early or perhaps had not been home at all. He looked up when she came in, and something crossed his face before he arranged it back into its professional neutrality. It was too quick for her to name, but it was not displeasure. "Miss Sullivan," he said, "I was not expecting you. I have an additional document for my file," she said, and placed it on the desk between them. He looked at it without touching it. "You might have sent it with the mail carrier." "I wanted to make sure it arrived," she said. A pause. "Do you not trust the mail?" "I do not trust the particular distance between my file and the Continental Company's legal team," she said, "so I prefer to deliver things in person." He picked up the document. His eyes moved down it with the speed of someone who read quickly and retained everything. She watched his hands while he read. They were careful hands, precise in their movements. The hands of a man who took care with things. "This citation is relevant," he said finally. "I thought so. It complicates the Continental argument significantly." "I thought that too." He set the paper down and looked at her directly, and the professional mask slipped just for a moment into something else, something that she might, if she were being incautious, have called conflict. "Miss Sullivan," he said, and his voice was slightly different, lower, and with a quality she had not heard in it before. "How are you managing the property, the cattle, the maintenance, alone?" She had not expected that question. She calibrated her response quickly. "I manage," she said. "Hiram Ray's from the neighboring property helps with the cattle on occasion. I teach school in town during the week and come back in the evenings. That is a great deal of work." "It was a great deal of work for my father too," she said. "He managed, so will I." Another pause. The morning light through the west window was different from the afternoon light. It was softer, and it caught the dust in the air of the office and made everything look slightly amber. "I want to tell you something," he said, and stopped. She waited. "This case," he said carefully, "is more complicated than some. I want you to understand that I am reviewing it with full attention to all the relevant factors." She studied him. "That is what you should say in this context." "Yes," he said, "it is." A long moment passed. Outside, the street was beginning to wake up, boots on the boardwalk, a wagon passing, a dog barking somewhere. "Is it also true?" she asked. He met her eyes, and this time the look that passed between them was different from anything that had passed between them in October. It was not professional. It was not a negotiator looking at a claimant. It was a man looking at a woman who had just asked him a direct question about his honesty, and who was waiting without apology for a direct answer. "Yes," he said, "it is also true." She picked up her bag. "Then I will let you work," she said, and went to the door, and this time she turned back once before she opened it. "Mr. Donovan," she said, "for what it is worth, I do not think you are corrupt. I think you are in a position that has made it convenient to act as though you were. Those are different problems." She left. He did not move for a long time after the door closed. Convenient to act as though he were. He turned that sentence over in his mind like a stone in his hand, feeling its weight and its edges. It was, he thought, the most accurate thing anyone had said about his situation since he had arrived in this territory. And it had been delivered without cruelty, which somehow made it harder to dismiss. He pulled the Sullivan file out and placed it at the very top of his stack. 2 weeks later, Marcus Donovan rode out to the Sullivan homestead. He told himself it was a routine inspection. Required documentation for the continuous occupation claim, visual verification of the property conditions, standard procedure. He had the paperwork to support it. He arrived in the early afternoon of a Wednesday, when the sky was the particular pale blue of a high desert November, and the plateau stretched out in every direction with the lonesome beauty of land that did not require human witnesses to be spectacular. He came around the last curve in the track and the homestead came into view, and he stopped his horse for a moment without meaning to. It was not a grand property. It was a clean one. The house was solid, whitewashed board construction, well maintained. The barn sat slightly uphill with its doors standing open. The fence lines he could see were in good repair. The cattle in the near pasture were in reasonable condition for autumn. There was a kitchen garden, frosted now but recently turned for the season, beside the south wall of the house. And Lydia Sullivan was standing in the doorway of the barn with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and a brush in one hand, and a look on her face that suggested she was not entirely pleased to see a federal officer on her property. He dismounted. He walked to the fence and opened the gate and led his horse inside, which was the polite thing to do, and he noted that she relaxed fractionally when he did it right. "Mr. Donovan," she said, not moving from the barn door. "I was not informed of an inspection. Regulations allow for unannounced property verifications for ongoing claims," he said, which was true. "I should have sent word regardless. I apologize for the discourtesy." She studied him for a moment. Whatever she was looking for, she apparently did not find grounds to turn him away. "Come in out of the wind, then," she said. "I will put coffee on." The inside of the house was spare and very orderly. There were books on a shelf by the window, a real collection of them, more than he had expected. A writing desk with neat stacks of papers that he recognized as school lesson materials. A photograph on the mantel of a man who must have been her father, solid and serious-faced, standing in front of the very fence line Marcus could see through the window. She made coffee on the iron stove with quick, practiced movements, and he stood near the door and watched, and felt, with a kind of surprised unease, that he was deeply comfortable in this space, as if the orderliness of it was something he had been needing without knowing. She set 2 cups on the table and sat down, and he sat across from her, and it was the same configuration as the land office, but the table was different, the light was different, the air was different, and everything about it felt completely unlike the land office. "You rode 8 miles to look at my fence posts," she said. "And the cattle," he said, "and the condition of the cultivation. And," she said, "everything I have seen is consistent with continuous occupation and active maintenance," he said. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Then say so in your report." "I intend to," he said. A silence that was different from the silences in the office, less adversarial. She looked at the photograph on the mantel, and he looked at the photograph too. "He looks like a man who would not give up without a fight," Marcus said. "He was," she said. "He expected the same of me." A pause. "He also believed that the law was worth trusting, even when it was difficult. I am trying to maintain that belief." He felt the words land somewhere in his chest and stay there. "That is a harder belief to hold than it looks," he said. She looked at him. "I know," she said. "How long have you been holding it?" It was not the question he expected. "I am not sure I am," he said honestly before he had decided to say it. She tilted her head slightly. The afternoon light came through the south window and touched the side of her face, and she was, he noticed for the first time with full attention rather than peripheral awareness, very striking. Not in the conventional performance sense. In the way that a landscape was striking, something that asked you to look at it properly and rewarded you for it. "Then perhaps that is something worth recovering," she said quietly. He looked at his coffee cup. He thought about Frederick Holly's, and about Daniel's medical bills, and about the 18 months of threading needles in this territory, and about the particular feeling of sitting in this kitchen in the middle of a high desert afternoon and being seen, clearly and without flattery, by someone who had every reason to despise him. He did not leave until the sun was beginning to drop toward the western edge of the plateau, which was later than any routine inspection required. They had talked, not about the land case, not exactly, about the territory, about what it had been before the syndicates came, what it might become. About teaching, which she spoke about with the same directness she brought to everything, without sentimentality but with genuine care. About law, which he spoke about carefully, and she listened to the carefulness and understood what it meant. He could see her understanding it. When he rode back toward Redemption Creek in the orange evening, he was aware that something had shifted in him that was going to be very difficult to shift back. Frederick Hollis arrived in Redemption Creek in the second week of December. He came in a private rail car and stayed at the town's one hotel with an entourage of 2 lawyers and a man whose function was never clearly stated, but who had the look of someone hired for the kind of conversations that did not happen in official offices. Hollis was a heavy-set man in his mid-50s, with silver hair and the expensive coat of someone who had never once questioned whether he deserved what he had. He summoned Marcus to the hotel within 6 hours of arriving. Marcus went, because not going would have been a statement he was not yet ready to make. He sat across from Hollis in the hotel's small private parlor and listened to Hollis explain, in the patient tone of a man explaining something to someone who was being slow, that the Sullivan case had been dragging for too long and that Continental was prepared to increase its offer for the parcel if the legal complications could be resolved promptly. The legal complications cannot be resolved unless the claimant's occupancy argument is dismissed, Marcus said. And the occupancy argument is factually supported. Hollis looked at him the way a banker looked at a disappointing loan. Marcus, he said, with the intimacy of someone who used first names as a dominance technique. The occupation argument can be found insufficient on procedural grounds if the proper paperwork is requested and the deadlines are applied precisely. The claimant has filed everything promptly and correctly, Marcus said. She has not filed a notarized declaration of primary residence, Hollis said. There is a form. If it is required and a deadline is set, and if she misses that deadline, she will not miss it, Marcus said. She has not missed a single deadline. She would file a notarized declaration in 36 hours if I required one. Then require it in 24, Hollis said pleasantly, during a school week. Marcus looked at him for a long time. At the silver hair and the expensive coat, at the calm, settled certainty of a man who had arranged the world to his specifications so many times that he had forgotten it could resist him. No, Marcus said. The word was quiet and very clean. Hollis's pleasant expression developed an edge. I beg your pardon. The procedural trap you are describing is fraudulent, Marcus said. It is designed to manufacture grounds for dismissal that do not exist legally. I will not do it. You took this appointment because I arranged it, Hollis said. The pleasantness was gone now, and what was underneath it was the thing that had always been underneath it, the plain face of power telling a smaller person to comply. I took this appointment, Marcus said, because I needed the position and because I believed I could do it fairly. I have not done it as fairly as I should have. That is something I intend to correct beginning now. He stood up. If you move to have me removed from this appointment, he said, I will file a detailed report with the Federal Land Commissioner documenting every procedural irregularity in the Continental Company's filings in this district for the past 2 years. I have reviewed every file in that office. Every one. He picked up his hat. I suspect that report would be of considerable interest to several people. He walked out of the hotel into the December cold and stood on the boardwalk with his pulse beating at twice its normal rate and the clean, cold air filling his lungs. He had just ended his guaranteed income. He had just stepped directly into the gap between who he had been and who he needed to be. He thought about Lydia Sullivan's voice saying perhaps that is something worth recovering. He went back to the office. He worked until midnight. He filed his formal recommendation on the Sullivan claim in the early hours of the morning, with a legal analysis supporting continuous occupation and recommending confirmation of the deed in Lydia Sullivan's name. He signed it with his full title and his name, and did not hesitate over the pen. He sent a copy to the Federal Land Commissioner's office in Washington, because he knew Hollies would move to interfere with the local processing, and he wanted it on record before that happened. Then he sat back in his chair and thought about what to do next. What he did next was ride out to the Sullivan homestead early the following morning before the sun was fully up, because she needed to know what was happening and she needed to know it from him. She came to the door at the sound of his horse, wearing a heavy wool coat over her house dress and her dark hair loose around her shoulders, which was the first time he had seen it that way. She looked at his face and read something in it immediately. "Tell me," she said. He told her everything. Frederick Hollies, the attempted trap, what he had done in the office the previous night. He told it plainly with the same directness she brought to everything because it seemed wrong to tell it any other way to her. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Are you in danger?" He was surprised by the question, not because it was wrong but because it was the first question she had asked, and it was not about her land claim. "I do not think Hollies will go so far as physical threat," he said. "The legal threat, yes. He may attempt to challenge my filing through the district court. If he does, then we fight it through the court," he said. "The legal record I have built will support the claim. It will take time, but the argument is sound." She looked at him steadily. He was aware of the morning around them, the cold, the pale sky, the horse steaming slightly in the winter air. "You risked your position," she said. "It was not a question." "Yes." "Why?" He met her eyes. In the morning light they were not gray as he had thought. They were a gray that had silver in it, like the sky before a storm, and they were watching him with the same unblinking attention she had turned on him in the office the first day, but now without the armor of adversarial necessity. Just directly, just honestly. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said. "And because the wrong thing was costing me something I did not want to lose." "What thing?" she asked. "The ability to look at you," he said quietly, "and not be ashamed." The silence after that was very long and very different from any of the silences between them before. "Come inside," she said finally. "It is cold." He did. Over coffee at the same table in the same morning light, something between them settled into a different shape. Not the shape of adversaries, not the shape of officer and claimant, but something more honest and considerably more frightening. She told him about her father in a way she had not before, the real stories, the specific ones. The way he sang Irish songs while mending fence in the summer heat. The book he had always kept beside his bed, Dickens, worn to the spine. The way he had cried exactly once in her presence, at her mother's grave, and then never again. He told her about Daniel and about Santa Fe, and about the morning 2 years ago when he had made a choice he had known was wrong and made it anyway because the cost of the right choice had felt too high. He did not dress it up. She did not ask him to. "You are trying to fix it now," she said. "I am fixing it now," he said. "The trying is over." She studied him with those silver-gray eyes, and something moved across her face that was warm and careful at the same time. The combination of it did something complicated to his chest. He rode back to town, and she watched him go from the door, and they were both aware that something had been opened between them that was not going to close back up. December in Redemption Creek had a particular quality of cold that came off the plateau in waves after dark, and the town huddled against it with extra lamp oil and extra firewood, and the particular human warmth of proximity. The Christmas social at the church hall was the event of the season, and everyone in the district came if they were able. Marcus had not planned to attend. He was not by habit or by temperament a social man. He lived narrowly and worked broadly and had not, in 18 months in Redemption Creek, formed anything that could fairly be called a friendship. He attended. He was standing near the door with a cup of punch he was not drinking when Lydia Sullivan came in with Hiram Reyes's wife, Maria, and the room was brighter for it in some way that was not about the lamplight. She wore blue, which he had not seen before, and her hair was arranged properly for the occasion, and she looked like herself but also like a version of herself that was allowed, for this one evening, to set down the weight of the land claim and the homestead and the dead father and simply be a young woman at a Christmas social. She saw him across the room and something shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly. Something closer to acknowledgement, like a question being answered by a presence. He crossed the room. He was not smooth about it. There were people to navigate and he did not have the practiced ease of a natural socializer, but he arrived at her side and she turned toward him as he did. "Mr. Donovan," she said. "Miss Sullivan," he said. "I did not know you would be here." "I did not know you would be here either," she said. "I thought," he said, and then was not sure how to finish the sentence, which was unusual for him. "I thought it was time I made some effort at being part of this place." She looked at him thoughtfully. "It is not easy, is it, belonging somewhere?" "No," he said. "I have not been particularly practiced at it." "Neither have I," she said, "though I am working on it." "My father believed belonging was something you earned by staying." "He was right," Marcus said. "I think." They talked for most of the evening, moving through the social geography of the room with the comfortable proximity of two people who had, without quite deciding to, placed themselves in each other's orbit. When the fiddle player struck up a reel, he asked her to dance with the careful formality of a man who was not sure of the answer, and she gave him her hand, and they danced twice, and the second time they were close enough that he could smell the lavender in her hair and feel the warmth of her hand through his glove. He walked her to Maria Reyes's wagon at the end of the evening. The night was very cold and very clear, with stars hard and bright above the plateau. "The filing," she said at the wagon, "do you think it will hold?" "The legal argument will hold," he said. "Continental may challenge it through the district court, but the record is strong. The commissioner's office received the copy I sent. It will take time, but yes, I think it will hold." She nodded slowly. The cold made a small cloud of her breath. He stood near enough to see it. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for the filing, for telling me the truth when you didn't have to." "I should have been telling the truth from the beginning," he said. "You are telling it now," she said simply. "That counts." She climbed up to the wagon seat and gathered the reins, and he stood in the street and watched the wagon move away into the cold dark, and he felt something that he had not felt for such a long time that it took him a full minute to recognize it. It was hope. Not legal hope, not professional hope. The personal, irrational, warmth in the chest kind of hope that has nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with one specific person. He went back to his rented room and sat in the dark for a while and thought about what he was going to do about it. What he was going to do about it, he decided, was be honest. In the same way she was always honest, directly and without performance. Because she had a way of accepting honesty that made it feel less dangerous than it usually felt, and he trusted that about her more than he had trusted anything in a long time. January brought a challenge from Continental's legal team, exactly as he had predicted. They filed a motion in the Territorial District Court arguing that his recommendation was procedurally improper, citing 3 points of technical objection. Marcus read the filing at his desk on a Tuesday morning and spent the afternoon writing a response that systematically dismantled each objection with the precision of someone who had spent 2 years reviewing every piece of land law documentation in the district and could cite the relevant precedents from memory. He sent the response to Lydia the same day, with a brief note explaining what Continental had filed and what he had answered. He sent it through the mail this time because she had trusted the mail's reliability, and he wanted her to know he trusted it too. She appeared at the land office the following Thursday. She arrived mid-morning, and the look on her face was different from every other time she had come through that door. The adversarial armor was not present. The careful professional distance was not present. She came in like someone who had simply come to see a person she needed to see. She sat down across from him and put his response letter on the desk and said, "This is brilliant." He felt warm in a way that was disproportionate to the compliment. "It is legally thorough," he said. "It is brilliant," she repeated. "The argument about precedent in Section 6 is something their lawyers are going to have a very hard time answering." "I thought so too," he said. "I have been building it for a while." She looked at him. "How long have you been building it?" "Since October," he said honestly. Her expression shifted, not dramatically, not with any external performance, but in the soft, private way that her face sometimes moved when she was genuinely affected by something and was not trying to hide it. "Since October," she said. "Since the first day you came in," he said. "I told myself I was reviewing the case. I was also preparing to defend it." The silence that followed was the warmest silence he had ever occupied. "Marcus," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name, and it did something irreversible to the air between them. "Lydia," he said. It felt like stepping off a ledge into something that turned out to be solid ground. "I think," she said carefully, "that I have been thinking about you with a regularity that goes beyond the professional requirements of this situation." He looked at her hands on the desk. He looked at her face. He thought about every conversation they had had and the way each one had felt like a door opening. "I have been thinking about you constantly," he said, "since the first day. I have been trying to decide whether to say so." "What decided you?" she asked. "You using my name," he said. She looked at him steadily. And then slowly the careful face that she showed the world, the face that did not flinch and did not blink and met every difficulty with clear gray eyes, softened into something private and luminous, and she smiled. Not the polite social smile she used in town, but a real one, wide and unguarded and unreasonably beautiful. He felt it in every part of him. "The court hearing," she said. "When is it scheduled?" "March," he said. "The 15th. "Then we have time," she said. "For what?" he asked. "To do this properly," she said. "I did not come out here to this territory to rush anything." He smiled, and it was an expression that had not been on his face in this office before, and it changed his face entirely. "No," he said. "Neither did I." February passed in a way that Marcus Donovan had no framework for and no complaints about. He rode out to the Sullivan homestead twice a week, ostensibly for documentation purposes that both of them understood were increasingly fictional. They sat at the kitchen table and talked, and the conversations moved through everything, through history and law and the territory and books and family and memory and loss and belief. She was reading a collection of Emerson that she had ordered from the Tucson bookseller, and she read passages aloud sometimes, and he listened. And the listening felt like something he had been rationing for a long time and was finally being allowed to have. She came to town on school days, as always, and he found himself arranging his noon hour to pass the schoolhouse when classes let out, not always stopping, sometimes just riding by to see the building where she was. He was aware that this was the behavior of a man who was very far along in something that was not going to turn back. He also used February to build the legal case with the additional detail it needed for the March hearing. He worked with a ferocity that surprised even himself, gathering documentation and precedent and carefully organized arguments that would withstand whatever Continental's lawyers brought to bear. He requested records from the commissioner's office that he had not requested before, documents that illuminated the extent of Continental's pattern of behavior across the territory, that showed Redemption Creek was not an isolated case, but part of a systematic approach to acquiring land through legal pressure. He sent copies to a newspaper correspondent in Tucson because he had decided that sunlight was the most effective disinfectant, and because he was no longer interested in the narrow threading of needles. The Tucson paper ran a piece in the third week of February about Continental's land practices across the territory. It named 4 cases by name, not including Sullivan, but the context was clear. Holly's issued a furious statement. 2 other affected homesteaders came forward with their own documentation. A territorial legislator began asking questions in the assembly. None of this resolved the Sullivan case directly, but it changed the air in which the case would be heard. On a Sunday in late February, Marcus arrived at the homestead with a basket from the Redemption Creek bakery because it was her birthday, which he had learned from the file and had not mentioned until today. She opened the door and saw the basket and looked at him with an expression that he was beginning to learn meant she was moved and was going to handle it with humor. "You read my file very carefully," she said. "I read everything carefully," he said. She took the basket and held the door open. "Then come in carefully." They had dinner at the kitchen table, which she cooked with the same efficient competence she brought to everything. A roast chicken and potatoes and dried apple pie that was genuinely extraordinary. He brought 2 bottles of wine from the mercantile, which she raised her eyebrows at but accepted, and they drank a glass each with dinner and talked until the lamp needed refilling and refilled it and kept talking. At some point in the late evening, after the pie had been eaten and the wine was finished and the fire had burned low and comfortable, she said, "Tell me about the person you were before all of this." He thought about it. "Before Holly's and the appointment." "Before the needle threading," she said. "Before you started being the thing you needed to be instead of the thing you were." He was quiet for a moment. "I was an attorney who believed the law was a protection," he said. "I took cases for homesteaders who could not afford large legal teams. I won more of them than I expected to. I thought the work mattered." "It did matter," she said. "Then it started to cost more than I had," he said, "and I chose the wrong way out." "You chose a human way out," she said. "And then you chose a better way. People are made of both those choices." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight on her birthday, with the warmth of a good dinner between them. She was looking at him the way she looked at everything, clear and full of attention and completely without softness in the conventional decorative sense, but with a depth of warmth underneath it that she only showed in moments like this, in the private spaces between the public face. "Lydia," he said. "Yes," she said. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you will allow it." She held his gaze. "I think," she said, "that you have been courting me for months, somewhat illegally, given that you were the officer on my case." "I was aware of the awkwardness," he said. "Were you aware," she said slowly, the humor going quiet, "that I was encouraging it?" "I hoped," he said. "I was not certain." "Be certain," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, which was warm and work-roughened and strong, and she turned it over and held his, and they stayed like that for a long while in the last of the lamplight, while the winter wind came off the plateau outside and made the fire glow. The district court hearing on March 15th, 1883, was the most crowded legal proceeding Redemption Creek had ever hosted. The courtroom, which normally seated 30, had 60 people attempting to occupy it, and the judge, a grizzled and experienced man named Harlan Oakes, who had been on the territorial bench for 9 years and was not easily impressed, looked at the crowd over his reading glasses with the expression of someone calculating how many of these people he was going to have removed. Marcus sat at the claimant's table with Lydia beside him, which was highly irregular, but which Judge Oakes, upon the explanation that Marcus had filed the supporting recommendation, and Lydia was the claimant, decided to permit because the alternative was 2 tables. Continental's legal team was 3 men from a Phoenix firm, expensively dressed and very well prepared, with a stack of documents and a court strategy built on the procedural challenge to Marcus's recommendation. Their lead attorney was a man named Pryor who had the kind of confidence that came from winning frequently in rooms that were arranged to favor him. Pryor had not been in a room like this one. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Marcus argued the continuous occupation case with a precision and a comprehensiveness that made several spectators lean forward involuntarily. He answered every procedural challenge with the applicable statute and precedent. He introduced the pattern evidence from the other Continental cases, which Judge Oakes allowed over Pryor's objection with the air of a man who had already read the Tucson newspaper. Lydia was called to testify, and she testified with the same quality she brought to every difficult thing, clearly, completely, without drama and without wavering. She described her occupation of the land in specific detail: the cattle management, the teaching schedule, the maintenance of the property. She described her father's filing, his tax payments, his stewardship of the land. When Pryor cross-examined her with a strategy built on suggesting that a woman alone could not genuinely constitute the kind of continuous occupation the statute required, she met his eyes and said, quietly and precisely, "The statute, Mr. Pryor, describes occupation in terms of presence and maintenance, not in terms of the occupant's sex. I invite you to show the court the section that specifies otherwise." Pryor could not, because it did not exist. Judge Oakes ruled from the bench, which he did not always do but chose to hear, and his ruling was in Lydia's favor on every substantive point. The Sullivan deed would be confirmed in her name. Continental's competing claim was dismissed. He added, in a brief additional paragraph that he read with the tone of a man who had made up his mind about something long before the hearing, that the procedural pattern exhibited by the Continental Company in its territorial filings was worthy of review by the appropriate federal authorities, and that he would be forwarding his own observations to the Land Commissioner's office. He banged his gavel, and the room erupted. Lydia sat very still for a moment while people pressed in around them with congratulations and the noise of the crowd. Marcus was beside her, and he turned and looked at her, and her face was doing something he had never seen it do, everything at once. Relief and grief and victory, and the specific complicated ache of winning something for someone who was not there to share it. She put her hand on the table to steady herself, and he covered it with his, right there in the crowded courtroom, and she looked at him, and the everything on her face settled into something clearer. "He would have liked you," she said. "My father. He would have argued with you about everything, and he would have liked you very much." "I would have liked the arguing," Marcus said. She laughed, which was not something she did often, and when she did it was worth waiting for. They stepped out of the courthouse into the March afternoon, and Redemption Creek was bright around them, and Lydia stood on the courthouse steps and looked at the street she had been walking down for 8 months and the land and the sky beyond it, and Marcus stood beside her and felt the particular quality of a day on which something that had been wrong in the world was, at least in one small part, made right. Spring came to the plateau with the slowness of a debt being repaid. The frost left the ground by stages, and the winter wheat Lydia had planted before the court hearing began to push up through the soil in the way that spring growth always looked, both tentative and inevitable. Marcus had submitted his formal account of the Continental pattern to the Federal Land Commissioner and to the Territorial Attorney General in late March, with a comprehensive document that had taken him all of February to compile. The response had been a federal review that was still ongoing in April when the newspapers were writing about it regularly. Hollis had, from what Marcus could determine through the official channels, hired his own legal team and was attempting to weather the storm. 3 other families whose homesteads had been improperly processed received revised rulings in their favor. Marcus had also, in early April, resigned his position as land negotiation officer. He had submitted his resignation before the federal review completed because he did not want to be part of the process he was helping to dismantle. He had already written to 2 former colleagues in Santa Fe about returning to private practice, and one of them had offered him a partnership that he was seriously considering. He told Lydia about the resignation on a Thursday evening when she came back from school to find him at her kitchen table with the resignation letter in his hand. She sat down across from him. "What will you do?" she asked. "Private practice," he said, "possibly here if there is enough work. The territory is going to need attorneys who understand land law for the next several years, I think, and I know the local cases better than anyone." "Will there be enough work?" she asked. "Probably not immediately," he admitted, "but enough." She looked at the letter. "You are certain?" "I am very certain," he said. "I stopped being certain about that position in October. I should have acted on it sooner." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "If you are going to stay in the area, you will need a proper office." "I know," he said. "The old Parker building on the main street is available," she said. "The landlord is Mr. Abercrombie. He is one of the people who gave a statement for my case. He would give you a fair rent." He looked at her. She was looking at the letter still with the particular expression she wore when she was deciding something. "You are trying to make sure I stay," he said. She looked up. "Yes," she said simply. He reached across the table and took her hand. "I was going to stay regardless," he said. "I just wanted to make certain you wanted me to." "Marcus," she said, with the exact tone she had used his name the first time, in January, in this same office that had made something irreversible happen in the air. "I have wanted you to stay since November." "November," he said. "The first time you rode out here and sat at this table and told me the truth," she said. "I knew then." He stood up and came around the table, which required commitment because the table was narrow and the kitchen was not large, and she turned her chair toward him, and he crouched down so he was at her level, which he was aware looked slightly ridiculous but felt correct, and he took both her hands. "I am in love with you," he said. Not loudly, not dramatically. With the same plainness she used for true things. "I have been for several months. I have been trying to find the right time to say it." She looked at him, and all the careful architecture of her public face was gone, and what was there instead was full and warm and his. "I know," she said softly. "I love you too. I have been waiting for you to say it so I could say it back." He stood up and she rose with him, and he put his hands on either side of her face very gently, and she put her hands on his chest. And the first time he kissed her it was as careful and thorough as everything he did, and she made a small sound against his mouth that told him everything he needed to know. Outside the window, the spring wheat was growing in the evening light, and the plateau stretched away in every direction, and somewhere in the south pasture, the cattle were moving toward water in the last gold hour of the afternoon. He proposed on a Sunday in May, in the kitchen garden where the first beans were coming up, without any ceremony beyond going down on one knee in the garden soil with the ring he had ordered from the silversmith in Tucson. And she said yes before he had finished the sentence, and then laughed at herself for the impatience of it, and he laughed too, and the garden around them and the late spring sky above and the whole wide territory felt, for that particular moment, entirely right. They married in June, in the church in Redemption Creek, on a morning when the plateau air was already warm but the church was cool, and the light through the east windows was brilliant. Maria Reyes was Lydia's witness. Marcus's brother Daniel, now recovered from his injuries and living in Santa Fe, had come out on the train for the occasion, and stood beside Marcus with the expression of someone who was deeply relieved by his older brother's choices for the first time in a while. Lydia wore ivory, which was simpler than a formal bridal dress but which suited her, and her hair was dressed with small white flowers that Maria had found blooming on the ridge. She walked into the church without anyone giving her away, because she was 26 years old and the land was hers and she gave herself, and she looked at Marcus standing at the front of the church with his dark eyes and his careful face and the slight undoing of the careful face when he saw her, and she walked toward him with the same quality she brought to everything, directly, unblinking, certain. Judge Oakes presided, because he had been asked by both of them and because he was, as it turned out, a romantic under the bench. The ceremony was short and exact, with vows they had written themselves, which was mildly scandalous and also completely appropriate. Marcus's vow included a line about the law of the heart being the oldest statute he knew, which made Daniel laugh and Lydia press her lips together to keep from laughing, and Judge Oakes permit himself a small smile over his reading glasses. Lydia's vow included a line about building something on ground that was worth keeping, and Marcus felt that line in his chest for the rest of the day. They had dinner at the church hall with most of Redemption Creek in attendance, because the territory was sociable and happy events were not wasted. The fiddle player from the Christmas social played again, and they danced, and this time without the careful distance of a new and uncertain thing. They danced close, and she laughed properly twice, which he was still cataloging as rare and precious. They went home to the homestead in the long summer evening, and the plateau was gold and purple in the late light, and the cattle were in the pasture, and the spring wheat had come up beautifully. She stood at the door of the house and looked at it the way she sometimes looked at it, with the private calculation of someone who was always accounting for what was there versus what was needed. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That the west pasture fence needs repairing before fall," she said. He laughed. It was a real laugh, and she turned and looked at him, surprised by it, and then laughed herself. "Also," she said more quietly, "that this is mine still, that we did not lose it." "No," he said, "we did not lose it." She took his hand and led him inside. Summer settled over the Sullivan homestead with a generosity that felt earned. Marcus opened his law practice in the Parker building in July, and the work came faster than he had expected. Not just land cases, but contracts and disputes, and the whole complicated legal texture of a growing territorial community. He was good at it, better perhaps than he had been at anything, because he understood now the full weight of what the law meant to people who had nothing but their claim to a piece of ground and the faith that the system would honor it. He rode between the homestead and town every day, and it was not always a short ride, but he found that he did not mind it. The plateau in the mornings had a quality of light and space that he had not expected to love and did, and the ride back in the evenings, toward the lamp in the homestead window that Lydia always left burning, was the best part of every day. She continued teaching. She had debated this, with herself and then with him, and he had been careful to let it be entirely her decision, because he understood that the schoolroom was not just work for her but something close to vocation. She continued, and the arrangement required logistics and early mornings and sometimes complicated dinners, and it worked in the way things work when two people are committed to making them work. In August they rode out together to the southern edge of the Sullivan land, the edge that bordered the territorial commons, and they spent a day checking the full perimeter of the fence line. It was the first time she had been to the southernmost boundary in several months, and when they got there she stood and looked out at the land, all of it visible from that slight rise, the house and the barn and the pastures and the wheat field, and he stood beside her and looked with her. "My father stood here the day he filed the deed," she said. "He described it to me once. He said he stood here and looked at it and thought, this is what I have made. Not the land was already there. But what he had made of it, what he had become in making it." Marcus put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they stood in the August wind with the whole of the Sullivan land in front of them. "I think he would have wanted you to know," she said, "that it is still here." "Tell him," Marcus said. "Wherever he is, I think he can hear you." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something very quietly toward the south, in the direction of the grave on the ridge where Robert Sullivan had been buried in March. He did not try to hear it. It was not for him. She straightened and turned back toward the horses. "The south fence is fine," she said, in the practical voice. "The east section near the creek needs attention." "Next week," he said. "Next week," she agreed. Fall came around again, and with it the first anniversary of that first meeting in the land office. Lydia mentioned it one evening at dinner with a slight smile, and Marcus looked at her across the table. "I was terrified of you," he said. She raised her eyebrows. "You were the most feared negotiator in the territory." "That did not help," he said. "You sat there and looked at me and did not blink, and I was completely undone by the third minute of that meeting." "You did not show it," she said. "I practiced not showing things for a long time," he said. "It is a useful skill that I intend to mostly stop using." "Good," she said. "Were you afraid?" he asked. That first day, she considered this honestly. "Yes," she said. "I was more afraid than I have been of anything except losing the land, which is why the fear of you did not win." "You walked in like you owned the territory," he said. "I walked in like I owned that specific plateau," she corrected, which was exactly the legal argument. He smiled. She looked at him across the autumn dinner table with the lamp between them and the wind outside and said, "I am glad it was you." "What do you mean?" he asked. "The opponent," she said. "The one I had to face. I am glad it turned out to be you specifically." He reached across the table. She gave him her hand. "So am I," he said. In the early winter of 1883, Lydia told Marcus she was expecting a child. She told him on a Sunday morning before church, standing in the kitchen, with the particular directness she brought to important things. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her for a long moment, and then crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and held her very carefully, as if she was something precious that had been handed to him unexpectedly, which she was. "A child," he said into her hair. "A child," she agreed, and she sounded for just a moment like someone who was afraid and glad in equal parts. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "A little," she said. "Are you terrified?" he said honestly. "Happier than I know how to say." She laughed against his shoulder. "Good," she said. "That seems about right." They told Daniel in a letter which he responded to with an enthusiasm that suggested he had been hoping for this development. They told Maria Reyes, who cried in a way that made Lydia very touched and slightly flustered. They told Judge Oakes, who responded with the gravity of a man making a formal record. "That child," he said, "will have been fought for before it was born. That is a fine beginning." The winter was kind. Marcus built a cradle from the good pine boards the carpenter had in his shop, spending 3 weeks on the evenings of it, learning woodworking by doing it, and producing something that was sturdy and smooth and made, with the kind of care he brought to work he cared about. Lydia watched him at it in the evenings and felt a warmth that was specific and complete, and unlike anything else she had felt. She continued teaching through March, which prompted some comment from certain residents of Redemption Creek, and she acknowledged the comment with polite attention and did not alter her plans. She stopped teaching in April, when the term ended, and the school would take a summer break regardless. The baby came in late May, which was the same month the spring wheat was at its best. Marcus was there, because he had arranged his practice around being there, and the birth was attended by the doctor from Redemption Creek and Maria Reyes, who was experienced in these matters. They had a son. They named him Robert, which was her father's name, and which felt right in a way that needed no elaboration. Marcus held his son for the first time on a May evening when the plateau light was doing its particular evening thing, gold and long and unhurried, and the child in his arms was warm and small and completely unaware of the territory of feeling he had just opened up in his father's chest. Lydia lay in the bed watching him hold the baby, and she had the specific smile she reserved for things that were real and complete in her own. "Hello, Robert," Marcus said quietly to the small face. "This is your land. We held it for you." Lydia heard that and looked at the photograph of her father on the mantel, and felt something that was grief and gratitude and love all pressed together into something she had no single word for. She thought her father would have approved. Not just of the land being held, of all of it. Of Marcus, of the fight, of the fact that his daughter had walked into a government office and looked the most feared negotiator in the territory in the eye, and had not looked away until the thing was done. The Federal Review of Continental Land and Cattle Company concluded in the summer of 1884 with findings that were significantly damaging to the company's territorial operations. Several of the improperly obtained parcels were reviewed, and in 4 cases reversed. Frederick Hollies resigned his directorship and moved east, which was where men like Hollies always eventually moved when the West declined to accommodate them. The pattern evidence Marcus had compiled was cited in the federal report, and the land commissioner sent a formal acknowledgment to his former office address, which was forwarded to his private practice. He showed Lydia the acknowledgment over dinner one evening. She read it carefully. "Do you want it framed?" she asked. "No," he said. "I want it filed." "In the Sullivan file?" she asked with just the edge of a smile. "The Donovan file," he said. "Sullivan Donovan, we should update the records." She passed the letter back. "You do love filing things correctly," she said. "I love things done right," he said. "It has taken me longer to apply that principle consistently than it should have, but I am getting there." She reached across and put her hand over his. "You are there," she said. "You have been for a while." Robert learned to walk in October of 1884, on the wooden floor of the homestead kitchen, with Marcus kneeling at one end of the room and Lydia at the other, and the baby taking the 3 necessary steps between them with the absolute confidence of someone who had not yet learned to doubt. They moved those 3 steps apart and he followed, then 6 steps, then 8. He sat down on the floor, looked at both of them, and made a sound of pure pleased indignation at having run out of walking. Marcus sat down on the kitchen floor without caring about his good trousers and held his arms out, and Robert crawled to him with the speed of someone going somewhere important. Lydia sat down on the floor too. The 3 of them were in the middle of the kitchen in the afternoon light, and it was, she thought, the most important thing that had ever happened in this room. Her father had made this floor. He had laid every board. She put her hand on the wood and thought, this is what you made, and what we are making. By the spring of 1885, Marcus's practice had grown enough that he took on a junior attorney from Tucson, a young man named Elliot who was earnest and slightly terrified of his employer's reputation, and became noticeably less terrified over the course of 6 months in Marcus's office, where the actual working atmosphere was rigorous and fair, and occasionally included Lydia arriving with Robert and staying for lunch. Lydia was expecting again by summer. She told Marcus on a Saturday morning, and his response was to pick her up, which he did not do often because she tended to express mild objections to the practice, and she let him this time because his face was so completely open with happiness that it was worth the dignity. "You are insufferable when you are pleased," she told him. "I will try to be less visible about it," he said. "Do not," she said. "Do not try." She had a daughter in the following spring, 1886. They named her Catherine, after Marcus's mother, who came from Santa Fe for the occasion on the train with Daniel, and spent 2 weeks on the homestead, behaving with the exact combination of firm opinion and generous warmth that Marcus had described in advance, and which Lydia found entirely to her taste. Mary Donovan looked at the homestead and the land and the order of the house and the school in town and her son's private practice, and said to Lydia on the second day, "He told me you were the finest person he had ever met. I thought he was exaggerating." "And now?" Lydia asked. "He was understating," Mary said crisply, and Lydia felt that was probably the finest compliment she had ever received. The years settled in around the Sullivan homestead the way years settle when the ground is right, with depth and increment and the particular satisfaction of things growing because they were tended to. Robert became a serious child with his mother's precise gaze and his father's deliberate manner of thinking, which was both impressive and slightly unnerving in a 4-year-old. Catherine was different, animated and quick-moving, crawling before Robert had, laughing before she spoke, keeping the household in a state of cheerful alertness. Marcus planted an orchard on the north side of the homestead in the fall of 1886, because the Tucson Agricultural Journal said the plateau elevation was right for apple trees, and he had decided to test it. Lydia planted them with him, on a Saturday in September with the air already carrying the first edge of fall, both of them with soil on their hands, and Robert following behind and filling in the holes after the trees were placed with great 4-year-old seriousness. The trees would take years to bear fruit. They both knew this. They planted them anyway because that was the kind of people they had become, people who planted things for the years ahead. In the evenings, after the children were asleep, they sat together in the small front room of the house, which Lydia had made into something comfortable over the years, with good chairs and her book collection expanding along 2 full walls and a rug from the trading post that was bright red, and that Marcus had pretended to object to on aesthetic grounds and secretly loved. He worked on case files, and she read or graded lessons, or wrote the letters she kept up with to teachers across the territory, a network of correspondence that had gradually become something more organized, a loose collective of educators sharing methods and advocating for school funding. "You are going to end up in front of the Territorial Assembly," he said one evening, watching her write. "Very possibly," she agreed without looking up. "Do you want me to prepare legal arguments for whatever they are going to resist? I have my own legal arguments, she said. You always do, he said. I am offering in case you want a second opinion. She looked up. Your opinion is the one I value most, she said. Don't tell Elliot. Elliot is deeply aware that his opinion comes second in this office, Marcus said. She smiled and went back to her letter. He went back to his file. The lamp between them burned with the steady golden light of a well-kept household, and outside the plateau was dark and big and full of stars, and the orchard they had planted was resting in its first winter, finding its roots in the high desert ground. In 1888, Robert Sullivan Donovan, at 6 years old, started school in Redemption Creek. He was taught in the mornings by his mother, which was the only slightly complicated part of the arrangement, because Lydia maintained with perfect professionalism the same standards for her son as for every other student. And Robert, who understood this with the instinctive comprehension of a child who had always watched his parents do things correctly, accepted it without complaint. He sat in the second row and worked as carefully as he did at home, and Lydia treated him exactly as she treated everyone else, and his classmates were none the wiser. And Marcus, passing the schoolhouse at noon occasionally, and seeing through the window his son bent over a slate with his brow furrowed, felt a specific pride that was almost too large for ordinary expression. He expressed it by coming home that evening and saying to Lydia, he had his brow furrowed over the arithmetic. He has your brow for it, she said. He will work it out. He had your posture, Marcus said, completely straight, not moving. That is how you sit when you mean it, she said simply. He put his arm around her at the kitchen counter. She leaned into him just slightly, the comfortable lean of people who had been doing this for years. He is going to be fine, she said. I know, he said. I just like looking at it. Looking at what? The evidence, he said, that we did this right. She turned and looked at him, and the look was all the things it had always been, direct and warm and honest and without performance, and underneath everything, the particular luminous certainty of a woman who had known what she wanted and had not looked away until she had it. We did do it right, she said. Eventually. Eventually, he agreed. The apple trees bore their first fruit in the fall of 1890. It was a modest crop, 12 trees at varying stages of maturity, producing enough apples for the household and a few bushels over. Lydia made preserves and a succession of pies. Robert ate apples until he turned slightly green and developed a philosophical stance on moderation. Catherine, 4 years old and very clear in her preferences, declared apple pie the finest food in the territory, and staged a small kitchen campaign for its production at every opportunity. Marcus stood in the orchard on the September morning of the first harvest with Catherine on his shoulders and a basket of apples at his feet, and the sun on the plateau turning everything warm and gold, and thought about September 1882, when this ground had been in contest, when everything he had been and was becoming had been fighting with each other inside him, when a woman had sat across from him with steady gray eyes and had not looked away. The world that had come from that moment was standing in this orchard, warm and complicated and entirely real. Lydia came out of the house and across the yard, wearing her work apron and her practical expression. She looked at the basket and at Catherine triumphant on his shoulders and at the trees that were finally doing what they were supposed to do. The north row is the strongest, she said. The southern ones need another season, he said. They will get there, she said. He looked at her. She looked back. Robert came running from somewhere behind the barn with his schoolbook under one arm and an apple in his other hand, having clearly been sampling before the harvest was formally declared open, and Catherine reached down from Marcus's shoulders with both arms toward her brother, demanding to be included. Marcus laughed and swung Catherine down, and she ran toward Robert, and Lydia stepped close to Marcus, and he put his arm around her, and they stood in the orchard they had planted together, on the land she had refused to give up, in the life they had made from a confrontation in a government office, and the long, careful, difficult, luminous work of becoming honest. The plateau stretched in every direction around them. The sky was the particular blue of a high desert fall, clear and deep, and without limit. The apple trees cast their first serious shadows on the ground. Robert and Catherine were arguing cheerfully about something at the edge of the orchard. The cattle were moving in the south pasture. The schoolhouse in Redemption Creek was waiting for Monday, as it always was, and the law office on the main street was waiting too, and the whole long business of the territory was continuing in the way it continued, with all its injustice and its beauty and its slow, uneven, sometimes redeemable progress toward something better. But here, on this ground on this morning, it was simply two people standing in an orchard they had planted, in the middle of a life they had earned, holding each other in the fall light. Lydia turned her face up to him. He bent and kissed her, warm and unhurried, the way he did everything now, without the careful professional armor, without the distance of a man who had learned not to be seen. She kissed him back and then looked at him with the gray eyes that had started all of it, on an October afternoon 8 years ago, when she had walked into his office and sat down across from him, and made him understand, in the quiet of her absolute refusal to flinch, that some things were worth coming back to. "Come help with the harvest," she said. "Yes," he said, and he followed her into the orchard, into the rest of it, into everything they had built and were still building, on the ground they had kept.